Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a pretty radical idea, one that starts with a really unsettling thought. What if some people who commit horrible crimes did so because they genuinely never learned the difference between right and wrong?
Yeah, let's really chew on that for a second. Imagine someone commits a serious, terrible crime, but in their own head, they truly believe they didn't do anything wrong. Not because they're justifying it, but because that internal compass, the one that tells us, hey, that's not okay, was just never built. This whole idea really sits at a fascinating crossroads between crime, morality, and, the way we're raised.
And it turns out, this isn't just a philosophical question. The research here is pretty clear. There's a powerful link. What happens to a person early in life, especially inside their own family, is one of the strongest predictors of whether they'll end up in trouble with the law later on. That foundation built in childhood? Yeah, it matters. A lot.
All right, Section 1, the architecture of morality. So how is that moral compass built? Where does it even come from? Well, it all starts at home, and it's hugely influenced by the kind of parenting a kid experiences. Okay, so the studies on this are incredibly consistent, and they show that parenting styles have a massive impact. Look here, on one side you've got what's called authoritative parenting. This is where parents are responsive, but they also set clear rules and expectations. They use reasoning. The result? Kids learn self-reliance, self-control. But then you have the other side, permissive or neglectful parenting. Here you see minimal warmth, few limits, and the outcome is starkly different: poor self-control and often aggression.
And this is where it gets really serious. The consequences of permissive or neglectful parenting, they're not small. These kids are way more likely to struggle with following rules. They lack impulse control, they do poorly in school, can be more aggressive. You see where this is going, right? Higher rates of substance abuse, and yeah, getting into trouble with the law. It's almost like a direct pipeline from one to the other.
Researchers have actually put a name to this pattern. They call it the coercive cycle. And it's basically this downward spiral. A kid misbehaves, the parent reacts negatively, maybe with anger or hostility, and that just makes the kid's behavior even worse. So they get stuck in this loop. Instead of learning what's right, the kid is basically getting a masterclass in antisocial behavior right there in the living room.
Okay, next section, when the foundation crumbles. So this isn't just about bad habits or behaviors. Let's go deeper and actually look at what's happening inside the brain when this moral foundation just isn't built right in the first place.
So this is super fascinating. Our ability to tell right from wrong isn't some vague philosophical thing. It is physically rooted in our brains. You're looking at key regions here, like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC. Think of that as the part that handles those gut feelings about what's right. And the amygdala, which is absolutely crucial for learning from our emotional experiences. These parts work together to build our moral brain.
And we know this because when people have damage to these specific areas, something really strange happens. They struggle to make moral decisions. They lose those gut feelings that guide the rest of us. It's like they can tell you the rule, they can say stealing is wrong, but they don't feel that it's wrong. They can know the words, but they can't feel the music. The moral understanding is just impaired.
And all of this leads to a really important concept called moral agency. So what is that? It's basically the capacity to be a responsible person in society, to understand the rules, reason about them, and be held accountable for your actions. And here's the kicker. It's not something you're born with. It is a learned skill, something that has to be developed, just like learning to talk.
All right, Section 3, punishment or programming. This is where it gets really thorny. If someone genuinely lacks this moral agency, if they were never programmed with a sense of right and wrong, then what exactly is the point of punishing them?
And this is a line of thinking that goes way back in philosophy. The whole idea of punishment is that it's a fitting response, but only for someone who is a morally responsible agent. In other words, it's for people who know what they're doing is wrong and make the conscious choice to do it anyway. But what happens when you're dealing with someone who isn't that?
So this makes you look at our entire justice system a little differently, doesn't it? What if our main tool for dealing with crime, locking people up, is actually being used on people who can't even grasp why they're being punished? And if that's true, could our solution actually be making the whole problem worse? Well, some research actually suggests it is making things worse. Think about it. Prison, by its very nature, takes away your ability to make choices. This can actually weaken the parts of your brain responsible for self-control, your executive functions. So you can see here, moral agency goes down, executive functions get weaker, and what goes up? The recidivism rate. Nearly half of all people released from prison re-offend. The system isn't fixing them, it might be breaking them further.
Okay, so if the current system is flawed, what's the alternative? This brings us to our final section, the parent license. Now this sounds pretty wild, but it's an idea that's been around for over 40 years, first proposed by a philosopher named Hugo Follett.
So La Follette's argument is actually really straightforward and logical. It goes like this. Step 1, some activities, like, say, driving a car, are potentially harmful to other people, right? Step 2, to do that activity safely, you need a basic level of competence. Step 3, if we have a reliable way to check for that competence, then Step 4, we should require a license for that activity. Makes sense, right?
And think about it. We do this all the time. We license drivers, doctors, lawyers, even hunters and boaters. Why? Because all of these are activities that can cause serious harm if you don't know what you're doing. We demand competence. And yet, for parenting, which is arguably the most impactful and potentially harmful activity of all, there's nothing. No test, no license, no minimum requirement.
And here's where it gets really weird. We actually do have a form of parent licensing in our society, but only for people who want to adopt a child. If you want to adopt, the state investigates you, assesses you, they make sure you're stable and competent. The entire system is designed to prevent harm before it can happen. But if you have a biological child, zero requirements. The law typically only steps in after a child has already been harmed. It's a massive, glaring inconsistency.
Now it's really important to be clear about the goal here. The idea isn't to punish people or to stop them from having kids, it's about protecting children before the damage is done. It's about shifting our whole approach from a reactive one, where we clean up the mess after a tragedy, to a proactive one, where we try to prevent that tragedy from ever happening in the first place.
So this idea, as radical as it sounds, forces us to ask a really fundamental question about society. Where do we draw the line? Where does an individual's right to have a family end, and our collective responsibility as a society to protect the most vulnerable begin? How do we make sure every child gets a fair shot at building that moral foundation they desperately need to lead a good life?